So we're here today in the Senedd with Bethan Sayed. Thank you for joining us to discuss the new inquiry into news journalism in Wales that has just been conducted by the Welsh Language, Culture and Communications Committee. Why did you feel it was necessary to hold this inquiry in the first place?
I thought it was important that we looked into news journalism in Wales because we hear quite a lot about the fact that Wales seems to be in a weaker position than the rest of the UK in terms of its news output, just because of the lack of plurality. So there's big forces dominating here in Wales. You've got the Wales Onlines of this world, you've got BBC and ITV, and I think some of the smaller companies perhaps feel that they can't get their voices through or that they don't exist. For example, in Scotland you've got Scottish versions of newspapers, or you have more channels that discuss Scottish issues, and perhaps Wales is not being served as well then in the type of discussion that we have about our politics or about the life we lead because of that lack of provision. So it's about coming up with solutions. We didn't want to sort of describe the problem in this report. We wanted to come up with some solutions, and what we say in the beginning of the report is we didn't have sort of one panacea thing that people said this will revolutionise the industry, but we had quite a lot of small ideas as to different types of models that could be implemented. But we're in an age where you're competing with the likes of Facebook and Google, so it's always going to be a challenge, and you will know that in your profession as well.
Absolutely, we're here to champion the small publishers, so we're delighted that they've had such prominence in the report. So who did you speak to altogether as part of the inquiry? You spoke to lots of different people, didn't you?
Yeah, we had lots of people who came in to give evidence, all the big players, as I've said, but we also had the trade unions in to give evidence, Dr Andy Williams from the Cardiff University Institute of Welsh Affairs, yourself, and we also talked to some of the hyperlocals, Caerphilly Observer, Wrexham.com as well, and we had Dr Rachel Howells, who you will also know, who used to run the Talbot Magnet in the region where I represent, which was a small-scale newspaper. They did go to print as well as produce online content about having a contestable fund via Welsh Government so that people can apply for those pots of funding, be it to start up a business or to sustain the one that they currently run.
We obviously think that's really important, because what we talk about a lot at the Centre for Community Journalism is, getting smaller news publishers up on a level playing field with the bigger news publishers, so getting access to press cards and statutory notices and getting access to grants and pots of money. Whereas when you're a really small startup, that's not always possible. So it's been really exciting for us to see that a lot of the recommendations favour support for hyperlocals. How do you see this working?
Well, basically there was a budget negotiation between Plaid Cymru and Labour in the last budget round, where there's going to be £100,000 in this year as budget, and then next year the same amount of money again. Look into the industry. I think originally the Cabinet Secretary was looking at that as being sort of a business advice portal, but we found from talking to people like yourself that it should be as broad as possible, because you may have different needs at different times, and we know that there are people here in Wales who are successful. We've already mentioned the Caerphilly Observer, but others who are trying to start up, like Nation.Cymru, who need that additional investment because they're running as volunteers quite often, and that simply isn't going to sustain their livelihoods or potentially work towards inviting content on a wider basis. So it's about seeing government investment in a positive light. As you've said, statutory notices already happen. Can we allow those statutory notices to go online, and can we support the industry just as we do at the moment with the Welsh language sector? Golwg 360 is already given government money. I think at a time like this, where there are issues with regards to the funding of the sector, government needs to step up and take a strategic outlook.
So what are the next steps? So the report is out today, so you've made a number of recommendations to the government. When do you expect to kind of hear from the Welsh Government on what their intentions are? What's the process that happens following a launch like this?
Well, we'll give them time now to digest what we've suggested, but they also have said that they're waiting on spending some of the money that I've just talked about for our report. So I thought that was really positive, because, of course, they could just go and do what they wish. but then they'll come back to us whether they accept recommendations or reject them. Then we have another discussion as a committee as to what we should do ongoing. But usually it leads to a debate in the National Assembly for Wales, where, you know, myself as chair and other members of the National Assembly will discuss things in this report that we care passionately about, and we will see what the government says. You know, some of these recommendations are actually to Facebook and Google saying they need to do more. We consciously put that in because we wanted to challenge them, but obviously, unlike government, there's no obligation for them to respond. Google gave us written information saying that they have a democracy initiative, but I'm not sure how much of that comes to Wales, and we had no response off Facebook, and you know, that's disappointing, considering they want to be the place where people create content, and they should be interested but didn't seem to be. And we're also concerned as well with Welsh Government not wanting potentially to establish the independent media forum that they themselves have been pushing for, because we really need to do some research work on what the landscape looks like, you know, audit what's out there, you know, how we can develop for the future. And I don't think without that forum that we can potentially achieve as much as we would have done without it, you know.
So that's a bit of a U-turn, because it looked like the forum was going to happen, didn't it? And now it's not.
Well, I think that's the problem sometimes with government, and personalities come into play, and I think the current minister with responsibility for culture doesn't seem to want to create it, but when he has talked about it on the record, he said, well, I don't think it would cost that much money. So it's not about, you know, pumping large sums into a new quango. It's about getting the people who are already in the industry, like yourselves, around the same table, who can have some funding, some core funding, to do some of this well-needed work to show where Wales is on the wider map on a global basis, really.
So what were the main findings that you had out of the whole investigation, the report, really?
Well, as we've already mentioned, the hyperlocal sector and that contestable scheme. We've also said there could be a sort of an arm's length hub for journalists that would be something like a newswire, so that people could get content and they could then use that for themselves. Obviously, we've got the BBC democracy scheme, which is trying to do something like that at the moment, whereby they are investing in journalists on a local level, potentially then to go in to cover things that are not being covered about Welsh politics at the moment in local councils. But I think some of us were sort of more cautious about it, hoping that an independent body, arm's length of government, could perform that role, because we found that NewsQuest and Media Wales have won those contracts via BBC. You know, how more plural is that going to get? You know, it's still the big companies dominating. I suppose if hyperlocals can access that content, that's good. But, you know, some of us are a bit cautious about it, and we want to see that reviewed within 6 months, so we can see how it's gone earlier than what they're predicting. We would like to see a review of that. And we've also, as I've said as well, made propositions to Google and Facebook in terms of their investment as well. And we've also said something good about Wales Online, although, you know, they'll be shocked, because we usually are quite critical, you know, in how they've said that they can work with those in the industry to upskill them. You know, for example, if there is a hyperlocal that doesn't necessarily have the skills that they want, that, you know, when we had Wales Online in, the editor, Paul Rowland, said, well, yeah, we can talk to them and we can see what skills we can help them with. Because, you know, people go there to read content, whatever we say about them. They are starting to do some more longer news stories. So, you know, that is, it's a credit to Wales, and we need to, you know, invest in that, yes, but also see what new content can be created here in Wales.
So the issue with Trinity Mirror is that they have got fantastic audience and reach, and that is continuing to grow, which is brilliant, because it shows that there's still an appetite for news and information in Wales. The issue is that because all the eggs are in the digital first basket, that only makes about 10% of the income that print advertising revenue used to bring in. So the kind of the readership is still growing and going up, but actually print readership is in decline. So I think the last statistics were just over 13,000 people buy the Western Mail, which is the national newspaper of Wales. Given there's 3.1 million people in Wales, that's less than 0.5% of the population that buy the Western Mail. So what I think the issue there is this digital first strategy, and that's something that you've discussed in the report as well, isn't it? Is that whilst it's excellent that they've got the audience and the reach, that unless it's going to be a good revenue stream, that we need to start looking at other ways of making money as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that they're not making the money yet from digital, despite having that digital first policy. And so it does create that environment where they need to be focused on the clicks, they need to be focused on who's going there, and they may not stay there for very long, and that's probably the problem with digital. But what we put in the report is also important to note. Again, talking about the big players, by 2020 Google and Facebook will take 70% of all UK online advertising. So this is the challenge really, and it's no one person's fault or it's no one person's responsibility to address it, but when they're such a dominating factor, we have to look at creative ways of addressing this.
Particularly in areas where, Talbot, for example, Facebook is really important because they lost access to all news and information when the Talbot Guardian closed overnight and became heavily reliant on things like Facebook. So adding...
And then local democracy, is waning then. Rachel Howells said in her piece of work on this that people weren't as engaged politically, and I represent Port Talbot, and they are passionate people and they want to be engaged. But with the Evening Post then becoming part of Wales Online, they feel a bit as if even that's been taken away, and branding is still important, and people have that affinity to the Evening Post that potentially people who are from outside the region don't understand. But that's an issue that's already happened, and we can discuss it, but it's gone now. But getting people involved in their own democratic processes is key for any growth of Welsh media. If it's not there, then they have nowhere to go, and there's a vacuum of news.
Absolutely. So how big an issue would you say, how concerned are you about the lack of plurality of voice in Wales, and how that's impacting on a democratic deficit?
Well, as we've found out, it's not exclusive to Wales, but Ofcom's advisory board did tell us that it, because of the lack of plurality, was felt more in Wales, and I think that's something that we should all be concerned about. It's not to say that there are not amazing journalists in the big companies, but it's just about, we don't want to see more newspaper closures. We want to keep those talents in their area. We want those journalists to be able to talk to people on the ground, and some of the former journalists I know at the Evening Post, they used to hold surgeries like I do as an AM in a local cafe, for example, so that they could then, now when the office was closed, the Guardian office was closed, they could talk to people anyway. And I think you have to come up with those type of innovative ideas. Otherwise, if you're sitting in an office far away from the story, you may never ever get that story. And so they had to make themselves accessible, but in a different way.
Because that was one of the points I wanted to ask, was how important is it, do you think, to have reporters actually on the patch, and the communities they serve? How important is it that they're physically there and part and embedded in their communities, as opposed to being in an office, 30 miles away? Well,
I talk to journalists all the time, and they say it's, invaluable for them to be as close as they possibly can to the story. If they're far removed, if they are, the same goes for the Glamorgan Gazette. I know I'm referencing my region, but that's my knowledge. They don't have, they're on the high street, and people just pop in, and even if they're having a chat over coffee, that means something, and that means something for the citizen as well. And so I think they're even struggling to get to very basic, things like court hearings or council meetings, and so perhaps this BBC democracy scheme will change that around a bit, where they'll give more flexibility to the current journalists there, that they can go off and do some more investigative stuff, because I think that's something we're really, we're missing in Wales, and we've got talent that can do that.
And it's a shame because there's no staff reporters from any big publications serving the Senedd anymore. All their political reporters have been withdrawn, haven't they?
Yeah, and of course then, if they're not around us to talk to us when we're not in committee or not in the Senedd, then they may not again pick up the phone or talk to us in that way. And I think that's really unfortunate, because I don't think you'd see that happening in Parliament or Holyrood. It's integral that they have that base of media there, because it legitimises the institution. It gives credibility to the institution, and for whatever reason, those decisions have been made here in Wales, and I think it's to the detriment of the discourse that we have about politics.
I've talked a lot about plurality of voice, and obviously one way of doing that is getting more independent publishers, which we are fortunate to have some fantastic ones in Wales, a small community and hyperlocal news publishers. There's always an issue surrounding the term hyperlocal because some people, so for example Wrexham.com cover the whole of Wrexham, you've got Caerphilly Observer covers the entire county, nobody covers as big an area as them, so there's always that kind of question of hyperlocal. But for us it's more to do with being small independent publishers. So this is a very positive report for people who are small independent publishers. What impact do you think this might have on them, the findings of the report?
I think it might just bring them up to a level where they feel that they're on a par with other news providers. I think at the moment sometimes it feels as if they've been discussed as a sort of lower level content creator, when often that is not the case. They are creating content that is just as professional, just as hard hitting, and it's something we need to support, because quite often some of these journalists potentially may have been made redundant from certain titles and they want to set up their own new business, and we need to be encouraging the setting up of small indigenous businesses here in Wales, and this is one key way of doing so. But what we did hear from people on the committee who gave evidence as well was, we need to be careful as to how we can't just, it's not one homogenous thing. There are some people with agendas, and there will be some people who may make mistakes along the way because they potentially haven't had the training they need. So, you've got to look at it in the round as well.
So the work we do at the centre, as you know, is helping, supporting, nurturing small independent publishers right across the UK. We've always worked very hands-on for the last 6 years in Wales. How important for Wales is it, do you think, that a centre for community journalism like ours exists, and the fact that it is in Wales?
Well, I think it's really important, and you helped form some of the rationale for our recommendations in relation to the contestable fund for hyperlocals, for example, because we could have gone a different way without coming to you for that expertise. And it's also a good signal to send for those who want to stay in Wales to study journalism, or for those who want to come into Wales and feel that they have a future. There's a progression there, and that's why whenever I'm approached by young journalists with yourselves, I always try and give them an interview, because some of them, I think Stefan Powell now is BBC introducing, and he does the hour for BBC Wales. He came to me quite a lot when he was a student to ask for interviews, and it's really great to see them progress through their careers to be successful as they are now.
So giving that support, and you've talked about some financial support, how important is financial support for startups and smaller publishers?
I think it's, this money isn't big, let's be frank about it, but it's something that wasn't there before directly for the sector. Yes, they can always apply for Business Wales support or general loans or grants, but, I was passionate about, the fact that we needed something purely for the sector, and I think that it's a statement of how important it is as well. And actually, like I said at the beginning, the fact that something has to be done. I don't think there should be any embarrassment or anything negative about governments getting involved in news journalism. It happens the world over, but as long as that's arm's length, and as long as it's not the civil servants running the news corporation, then we're okay to go. And I think that's something that we have to be much more we just need to normalise it more and not be scared of talking about it.
How easy do you think it would be for the government to remain at arm's length if it provides financial support for the local journalism sector across the board in Wales?
I think they, as with Golwg 360, the Welsh language news provider, there has to be reviewing processes in place, auditing in place, and there has to be that recognition that government will be criticised, and you can't control the content of the stories that they want to go with. And I think it would be the wrong type of setup if government could dictate to anyone in the journalism sector what they did their stories on, and it would have to have very tight controls in that regard. But I'm perfectly happy that can be done, having seen other models work here in Wales alone and models in other parts of Europe.
Of all the recommendations you've made, are there any that you feel really strongly about, that you think of all of them, these are the ones we absolutely must see through and deliver on?
Well, I mean, the money is there for the fund, so I would say I'd be passionate about making sure that that money is spent correctly, and that we review that. We say we need to review where that money goes because it's new money, so that's something that can be done now. I would say that the media forum is something we can control as well, so we will be pushing hard for that to be created, but we've tried to keep it to the solutions, and so things we can influence, such as the statutory notices. So it's very difficult to say which one is the panacea, but let's see what the government says, and hopefully we can have a wider debate with the people of Wales and with those interested in news journalism in Wales about how we can better provide for our nation, because people come to me all the time saying that they don't feel that the UK networks or that some of the UK newspapers reflect Wales back at us, and we're not going to be able to develop our institutions or our communities in Wales if they simply do not know what we are doing as politicians. And
that's really important, isn't it? As journalists, we need to kind of be talking about what's happening in Wales and be proud of what we're doing. But if we don't have those journalists on the ground, then it's very difficult to cover, our own news. Why can we expect people from England and Scotland to start covering what we do if we don't shout about it ourselves? So for those that haven't read the report, the access to statutory notices, at the moment, access to statutory notices gets published, public notices, that spend gets given to newspapers traditionally to publish public notices. And what you're calling for is a wider access to that, so that it does not exclude digital only publications, and that actually you don't have to be a traditional newspaper in order to carry public notices. So it's kind of like an overhaul, really, isn't it, to look at modernise the statutory notice system. This is an issue across the UK, so wouldn't it be wonderful if we started something in Wales that was then adopted UK-wide?
Yeah, because those notices, for planning or whatever it is, have to be done, but we don't have a clear picture yet as to where they're put or how they're operated, so we have called for a review of what the government actually does in terms of statutory notices. They have made exceptions, for example, for some papers for one hyperlocal to put it online. So we need to get clarity over the law and whether it could happen and how it could happen then, because that could then be used as a core seed funding for either a news hub or for an organisation, because currently it's tied up in the newspaper industry, and yet if we could lead on it here in Wales, then that would be something amazing.
If I sit with you in a year's time and we have this conversation again, where would you hope we are?
I'd hope we would be that we would see a situation where if there was a new Port Talbot magnet that's been set up, say Pontypridd News or something, I'm just making words up, that they would be able to set up and they would be able to be still here, and sustainable. That's where I think we need to be, but we also need to be looking to the future, at future trends. We can't stand still, so I think work needs to be put into that so that we're at the front of the game in relation to the next big thing, and that's what I'd like to see us be in a year's time, not still saying the situation is bad, but saying that we've allowed for progression in the industry.
Great. Well, I look forward to catching up with you, hopefully before a year's time anyway, and see where we go from there. We'll continue our conversations as well, and hopefully the government will pick up on some of your fantastic recommendations. We are obviously delighted that so many of them really recognise the value that independent community and hyperlocal news publishers bring, how important they are for democracy, for plurality, and actually for good civic society. The work they do is brilliant, and the fact that's been recognised in this report, we are obviously really appreciative of.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say as well, if anybody wants to get in touch with any ideas we may not have thought about, I think that's really important, because committees are there for hearing what people have to say and sharing ideas, and we don't have the answers, all the answers as politicians. We we have to share those ideas as a in the Welsh public that we are, and hopefully we have had lots of interventions and ideas, but there's always room for more.
How would somebody get in touch with you?
They can email, well, we're on Twitter at Senydd Cwlc, LC, or they can email myself, Bethan.Sayed at assembly.wales. But there's obviously the Assembly Wales website where all the lists of committees exist, all the past work and future work that we're doing is on there, and they can watch live on Senedd.tv every Wednesday or Thursday, because we swap over what we are doing as a committee, and we're doing an inquiry into radio and film at the moment, so there's plenty of opportunity for people to get engaged.
Excellent, thank you very much, Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch.
Thank you.